She died with more than £21 million to her name. She left behind a will, a letter, and a set of wishes she believed were sacred. But by the time her sons were old enough to understand what their mother had planned for them, the money, the jewelry, the personal items she had set aside with her own hand, the truth had already been buried, altered, and kept secret for years. And when the full picture finally came to light, it left a young Prince William standing in silence, facing a story about his mother he never saw coming. There are moments in history that appear simple on the surface, but carry enormous weight underneath. The death of Princess Diana on August 31, 1997, in a Paris tunnel shocked the entire world. Millions mourned her. Flowers piled up outside Kensington Palace for days. Grown men wept on the streets of London. A light, people said, had gone out. But while the world was grieving the woman, the princess, the humanitarian, the mother, a quieter story was beginning to unfold behind palace walls. It was a story not about grief, but about money, about a will, about decisions made in secret, and about a financial truth that would take years to fully surface. Diana was not a passive woman when it came to her finances. People sometimes forget that. They remember her for her warmth, her charity work, her ability to connect with ordinary people in extraordinary ways. But Diana Frances Spencer was also a woman who had survived one of the most complicated and painful divorces in modern royal history, and she had come out of it with something she had never fully possessed during her marriage: financial independence. By the time she died, she had built a life that was entirely her own, and the wealth she held was the foundation of that freedom. At the time of her death, Diana's estate was valued at approximately £21 million, equivalent to somewhere between 28 and 30 million pounds in today's money. That figure included her cash reserves, her stock investments, her personal property including jewelry and clothing, and the enormous divorce settlement she had received from Prince Charles just 1 year before she died. That settlement alone was reported to be worth around £17 million, though some accounts put the figure higher. One of Charles's former financial advisors, Geoffrey Bignell, would later claim that Diana had effectively taken every penny the Prince of Wales had personally owned. He told a Sunday newspaper that Charles had been forced to liquidate all of his personal investments to make the settlement happen. It was not a friendly arrangement. It was a hard financial negotiation, and Diana had won. But Diana had not accumulated her wealth carelessly. She was deliberate. And nowhere was that more clear than in the careful way she structured her will, a document she had signed in 1993, the year of her formal separation from Charles, and then slightly amended in 1996 following the divorce. The will was comprehensive. It named her 2 sons, Prince William and Prince Harry, as the primary beneficiaries of her estate. It also named her mother, Frances Shand Kidd, and her sister, Lady Jane Fellows, as the executors, the people responsible for carrying out her wishes after she was gone. Diana's instructions were clear. 75% of her jewelry and personal possessions would go to William and Harry. The remaining 25%, a meaningful portion by any measure, was earmarked for her 17 godchildren. The rest of her estate, the bulk of the money, was to be held in trust for the 2 princes until each of them reached the age of 25. Additionally, Diana left £50,000 to her loyal butler, a gesture that spoke to the kind of loyalty she valued in the people around her. The will also reflected another layer of Diana's planning, a separate document known as the Letter of Wishes, which she had written the day after signing her will. In it, she added further specificity. All of her jewelry and 3/4 of her personal belongings, her chattels, in the legal language of the document, were to go to William and Harry. 1/4 of those personal items were to be divided among the godchildren. It was a thoughtful plan. It was the plan of a woman who had thought carefully about what she owned and who she loved. Then Diana died, and the plan began to change. In December of 1997, just 4 months after the crash in Paris, Diana's mother and sister, her 2 executors, went to the probate court and did something that would remain secret for years. They requested what is legally known as a variation order. This was a formal court application asking a judge to permit them to distribute Diana's estate in a way that was different from what the will specified. They obtained it, and the changes they made were significant. Under the variation order, William and Harry would no longer receive their full inheritance at age 25, as Diana had wanted. Instead, the distributions were delayed until each prince turned 30. They would be allowed to receive income from the trust, interest on the growing estate, from the age of 25, But the principal, the real money, would remain locked away for another 5 years beyond what their mother had planned. Additionally, the variation order fundamentally changed what Diana's godchildren would receive. Instead of sharing a full quarter of Diana's personal possessions, a share that experts estimated would have been worth at least £100,000 per godchild, and possibly more, each of the 17 godchildren would now receive just a single memento, a single item chosen by the executors themselves. Some of those items were later described by the disappointed families as little more than token objects. Most troubling of all, none of this was disclosed to the parents of the godchildren. The variation was obtained quietly, without informing anyone who stood to lose from the change. The parents of those godchildren, most of whom were still minors themselves, had no idea what Diana had originally intended for their children. They had no idea that a court order had just altered those intentions. They were simply never told. The secret held for years. It was not until an entirely unrelated legal case, a court case involving Diana's butler and close confidant, that the existence of the letter of wishes and the variation order finally came to public attention. When the parents of the godchildren were told what had originally been planned for their children, and what had quietly been taken away from them in a courtroom 4 months after Diana's death, the reaction was one of shock and outrage. These were people who had been close to Diana. She had trusted them enough to name their children as godchildren, and now they were learning that her financial wishes for those same children had been changed without a single phone call, without a letter, without any acknowledgement at all. The legal reasoning behind the change rested on a technical flaw in how Diana had written her letter of wishes. The document used words like wishes and discretion rather than the binding legal language that English probate law required to make such instructions enforceable. Because of that, the executors were legally permitted to use their own judgment about whether to honor the letter. They chose not to, or at least not fully. The law allowed it. But many who studied the case felt that the spirit of what Diana had intended had been quietly set aside. By the time Prince William turned 30 in 2012, he received his share of his mother's estate. It amounted to approximately £10 million, around $16 million at the time. Prince Harry received his share 2 years later in 2014, when he turned 30. By then, the estate had been carefully managed over 17 years, growing through conservative trust investments. The money Diana had accumulated in the final year of her life, cash reserves, stock portfolios, her divorce settlement, had been preserved and had grown modestly through passive management, not through any active commercial strategy. The result was that both sons eventually received substantial inheritances. But they received them 5 years later than their mother had wanted, and under terms their mother had never approved. There was one more detail in the financial story of Diana's estate that few people outside royal circles fully understood, and that added yet another layer to the complexity William faced when the full picture came into view. Under United Kingdom law, because Diana had died within a year of receiving her divorce settlement from Charles, Charles technically had the legal right to reclaim that settlement money. He was advised not to. His advisors reportedly told him that attempting to reclaim it would be disastrous from a public relations standpoint. The optics of a king taking back money from his dead ex-wife's estate, money that would then flow to his sons, were simply untenable. Charles followed that advice and did not pursue the reclamation. The money stayed in the estate, but the fact that such a move had even been legally possible was something few outside the palace's financial and legal circles knew existed at the time. There's also the matter of what Diana's sons will never inherit, a fact that carries its own kind of weight when the full story of her financial life is told. William and Harry did not grow up thinking of Althorpe, the Spencer family estate in Northamptonshire, as theirs. Althorpe is the home where Diana spent her childhood. It is also where she is buried, on a small island in the middle of an ornamental lake on the estate grounds. But Althorpe belongs to the Spencer family, not to the royal family, and it will pass as all ancestral estates do through the Spencer line. The heir to Althorpe is Louis Spencer, the son of Diana's brother Earl Charles Spencer, William and Harry's cousin. The estate, the land, the childhood home of their mother will go to someone else entirely. It is not a betrayal. It is simply the reality of how aristocratic inheritance in England works. But it is a reminder that Diana's connection to her own family's world, the world she came from before she became a princess, was always somewhat separate from the world she married into. When the full scope of what had happened to Diana's estate became publicly known, the reaction was complicated. Some felt the executors had made reasonable, practical decisions, that extending the age of inheritance to 30 was actually protective of two young men who had just lost their mother and were still growing up inside one of the most scrutinized families on Earth. Others felt that Diana's wishes had been rewritten without justification, that the godchildren had been shortchanged, and that the secrecy surrounding the variation order was itself a betrayal of the transparency Diana had tried to build into her planning. The truth, as it often is in such matters, sat somewhere between those two positions. What is not in dispute is the effect that the revelations had on Prince William. He was 15 years old when his mother died. He was 30 when he finally received the inheritance she had left him. By then he had become a man, a husband. He had married Catherine Middleton the year before, and he was beginning to understand the full scope of what his mother had built and what had been done with it in the years after her death. Learning that the will had been quietly altered, that the godchildren had received far less than his mother intended, that the entire arrangement had been kept from public knowledge for years through a combination of legal technicality and deliberate silence. It was not the kind of story that leaves a person unchanged. By multiple accounts, William was left deeply thoughtful, processing a version of his mother's legacy that was far more complicated than the simple narrative of a princess who died too young. Diana had planned carefully. She had signed her will, written her letter, set out her wishes in clear terms. She had trusted the people she named as executors with the most personal task one person can ask of another, honoring their intentions after they are gone. What happened instead was a legal rearrangement, done quietly, that reshaped the financial reality of her estate in ways she had never approved. The money still reached her sons. William and Harry are not men who suffered from poverty, but the story of how it reached them and what was changed along the way, and who was never told, and what it meant to a young prince who spent 15 years not knowing the full truth about his mother's final financial wishes. That story is the one that lingers. In the end, the greatest bombshell was not the money itself. It was the gap between what Diana had wanted and what was actually done. A gap that stayed hidden for years, surfaced through an unrelated court case, and left the world, and a prince, with a new understanding of just how quietly complicated the story of even a £21 million estate could become.